The call came on a Tuesday afternoon toward the end of November, and on the other end was my daughter-in-law's voice, cheerful and warm, the way it usually sounded when she was hoping for something. "We thought it might be wonderful to spend Christmas at the lake house this year," Sandra said. "The kids haven't been there in ages." Then she added lightly, "And you really shouldn't be up there by yourself during the holidays, Robert." I told her that sounded perfectly fine. I said I would start getting the place ready. What I didn't mention was that 3 days earlier I had already spoken with my lawyer, and that conversation had quietly changed everything. But to explain any of this, I have to go back to the beginning, because without that context, none of it really makes sense. My name is Robert Hargrove, and I turned 68 last September. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Winnipeg, designing drainage systems, bridge supports, and all the practical infrastructure that keeps a city functioning even if nobody ever notices it. I retired at 62 with a modest pension and moved full-time to the lake house on the eastern shore of Lac du Bonnet, the place my wife Eleanor and I had owned since 1994. We bought it when our son Michael was 11 and our daughter Emily was 8. We painted every room ourselves over the first 2 summers. Over the years, we rebuilt the dock 3 separate times. In 2007, we buried our old retriever, Pepper, beneath the Manitoba maple tree near the edge of the property, and that day, Eleanor cried harder than either of the kids. Eleanor passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in March and gone by October, 7 months from the first scan to the final breath. I was beside her through every part of it. I held her hand in that hospital room in Winnipeg, and I talked to her about the lake house, about how the sunlight used to shimmer across the water early in the morning, about the loons we could hear from the bedroom window during summer nights. I promised her I would keep the place just the way she loved it, and I meant every word. After she was gone, I did exactly that. I held on to the house. Winters I spent in Winnipeg, renting a small apartment not far from the university, and the rest of the year, spring, summer, and fall, I stayed out at the lake. I wouldn't say I was lonely, not exactly. I still had 2 or 3 old friends from my working years who called from time to time. I had Emily, who lived in Calgary with her husband and their 2 daughters, and who phoned me every Sunday without fail. And I had Michael. Michael was 41 and living in Winnipeg with Sandra and their 3 boys. During the first year after Eleanor died, he visited the lake house often. He brought the grandchildren with him. He helped me install a new water heater and patch a section of the roof that had lifted during a spring storm. Some evenings we sat together on the dock, talking about his mother, about the boys, and about the accounting firm he had started with 2 partners 6 years earlier. That business, as it turned out, was where the trouble had quietly begun, though I wouldn't understand that until much later. Sometime during the 2nd year after Eleanor's death, the visits started to thin out. Michael called less often, and when I did see him, there was something different in the way he looked at me, something measured and cautious behind his eyes that I couldn't quite place. I told myself he was simply busy. The firm was growing quickly. The boys had hockey practices and school events. Sandra was involved with several community boards. People's lives fill up. I understood that. The lake house, by then, was worth real money. Property values along Lac du Bonnet had been rising steadily through the 2010s and had jumped even more sharply after 2020. The house and its 3/4-acre lot were assessed at just under $900,000. I also had a registered retirement income fund worth roughly $400,000, a small defined benefit pension, and the proceeds from Eleanor's life insurance policy, which I had invested carefully and which had grown to about $220,000. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was comfortable. Everything I owned was paid off. I carried no debt. I only mention these numbers because they seem to matter more than anything else to certain people. In October, about 2 months before Sandra made that call, I went in for a routine appointment with my family doctor in Winnipeg, a standard checkup before winter. My blood pressure was excellent. My cholesterol was well within the normal range. The only thing that stood out was a slight irregularity in one of my liver enzyme readings that my doctor wanted to keep an eye on. He told me it was almost certainly nothing, possibly from a supplement I had been taking, but that he wanted to repeat the test in 3 months, just to be safe. At the time, I didn't think much about it, but I made the mistake of mentioning it to Michael when he stopped by my apartment the following week for dinner. He asked about it with what seemed like genuine concern, and I told him exactly what the doctor had said, that it was probably nothing, and that we were simply keeping an eye on it. He nodded, asked a few more questions, and said he was glad I was looking after my health. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm I had never heard of requesting documentation related to the estate of Eleanor Hargrove. The letter listed my name as the sole executor and asked that I contact their office as soon as possible to discuss the status of several assets. It was written in the dense formal language, typical of legal correspondence, and at first I assumed it was some routine administrative matter I had overlooked. I called the number printed on the letterhead. The attorney who answered was a woman named Deborah Hayes. She sounded surprised to hear from me, and even more surprised when I explained that I had no idea why her firm had contacted me. There was a long pause on her end of the line. Then she said carefully that she had been retained by a third party to conduct a preliminary inquiry and that she was not authorized to reveal who had initiated the request without further instruction. I asked her directly, "Was my son Michael involved in this?" Another pause followed. She said she could not comment on that. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the Winnipeg apartment for a long time afterward, staring out the window at the gray November street. I thought about the way Michael had looked at me over dinner, the measuring look in his eyes, and about the questions he had asked regarding my health. The next morning, I called my own lawyer, a man named Raymond Cole, who had handled our family's legal matters for 15 years. He had drafted our wills, overseen the title transfer for the lake house, and was someone I trusted completely. I told him about the letter. I told him about my conversation with Michael. I told him about the liver enzyme result and the questions Michael had asked. Raymond listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Robert, I need you to come into the office today if you can." I went that afternoon. In the time between my call and my arrival, Raymond had already done some preliminary digging. What he discovered was this: Michael's accounting firm had accumulated significant debt over the previous 2 years. 2 of the original 3 partners had left, one to open his own practice, the other under circumstances Raymond described cautiously as disputed. There had also been a lawsuit from a former client. It had been settled, but it was expensive. The firm had taken on a line of credit at levels that Raymond, who had witnessed many small business collapses during his career, described as deeply concerning. None of this had ever been mentioned to me, not once. Then Raymond told me something else. He had a professional contact at the law firm that had sent the letter, someone he had worked with years earlier on a joint case. He had placed a discreet call. The inquiry, it turned out, had been initiated to understand the process of contesting a will. More specifically, the research focused on the legal grounds for challenging an executor's decision-making capacity if that executor could be shown to be experiencing cognitive or physical decline. I sat across from Raymond's desk and let that realization settle in. They were building a case. Maybe not openly yet, but the groundwork was clearly being laid. The questions about my health, the attention to that liver enzyme result, the legal inquiry about contesting a will. My own son was preparing for the possibility that I might be declared incapable of managing my own affairs. And if he could establish that, or even create enough legal doubt, there might be a path toward gaining control over assets that could solve his firm's financial problems. I drove back to my apartment in the dark that evening. I sat in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go upstairs. Michael was my son. I had coached his hockey team when he was 9 years old. I had driven him through the rain to his university orientation, carried boxes with him up 3 flights of dormitory stairs, bought him coffee in the cafeteria, and told him how proud I was of him, and meant every word. I had danced with Eleanor at his wedding. I had sat in the hospital waiting room when each of his boys was born, and I had held those tiny babies in my arms when they were only hours old, feeling something so overwhelming it didn't even have a name. And now he was researching how to have my competence questioned so he could reach into my accounts and my property and take what he needed to cover his failures. When I finally went upstairs, I poured myself 2 fingers of rye, something I almost never do. I drank it slowly. Then I picked up the phone and called my daughter Emily in Calgary. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. There was a long silence on the line before she spoke again. Finally, she said quietly, "Dad, I need to come to Winnipeg." I told her not yet. I explained that I needed a few weeks to understand the situation properly before anything was said or done. I told her I loved her and asked her to trust me to handle it. She agreed, though reluctantly, on the condition that I call Raymond again first thing the next morning and that I keep her informed about every step. I promised I would. Raymond and I spent the next 3 weeks working carefully and methodically. We conducted a thorough review of my will, updated several clauses, and executed a new power of attorney naming Emily as my primary decision-maker in the event of incapacity, with Raymond listed as the secondary. We also formally documented my current health status through a written evaluation from my family doctor, confirming that my cognitive and physical condition were excellent and that the liver enzyme irregularity had indeed been caused by a natural supplement and had already returned to normal on a follow-up test. Every document was dated, signed, and properly filed. Raymond also advised me, very calmly, that I should be careful in the way I interacted with Michael over the next few weeks. Nothing should appear different on the surface. The worst thing I could do would be to let him realize I knew what he was attempting before everything was securely in place. So when Sandra called with the invitation to spend Christmas at the lake house, I said yes. I told her it sounded wonderful. I even asked if the boys were excited. During the first week of December, I drove out to Lac Dubonnet to open the house and prepare it for the holidays. The air was cold and clear, the edges of the lake already frozen, while dark water remained in the center. The Manitoba maple above Pepper's grave had shed all its leaves and stood bare against the pale winter sky. Inside, the house carried that particular cold stillness that settles into a building when it has been closed for months, a scent of wood, dust, and the faint trace of the lake itself. I walked slowly through every room, checking the furnace, the plumbing, the smoke detectors. Finally, I stood in the bedroom Eleanor and I had shared through 30 summers, looking out at the water through the window, and I allowed myself a moment to feel the grief, clean, honest, before setting it aside and getting to work. They arrived on the 23rd. Michael drove, with Sandra in the passenger seat and the 3 boys, Owen, 16, Marcus, 13, and little Theo, 8, crammed into the back with their bags, devices, and that restless energy that comes from being in a car for 2 hours. I stood on the porch, watching the truck make its way down the lane. I smiled and waved, feeling the complicated weight of what I knew and what I could not yet say pressing against my chest. The evening was good. That was the hardest part, how good it was. Owen helped me carry firewood from the stack by the shed. Marcus wanted to hear about the engineering work I had done on the city's flood control systems, which surprised me and moved me more than I expected. Theo fell asleep on the couch before 9, and Michael carried him to bed before coming back down to pour himself a beer. For a fleeting moment, I saw something familiar in his face. The boy I had raised, tired, a little lost, waiting for something he didn't know how to ask for. I thought if he had simply come to me, sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Dad, I'm in trouble. I need your help," I would have found a way. I would have helped him. I was not a man who valued money over family, but he hadn't come to me. Instead, he had gone to a law firm and started building a plan. At dinner on Christmas Eve, Sandra had made her annual tourtière, accompanied by mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, and a salad the boys largely ignored. The candles on the table were the tall white ones Eleanor had always used, which I had found in the same drawer she kept them. We ate and talked, and the boys bickered over something inconsequential that made everyone laugh. Then Michael raised his glass. "To Dad," he said, "and to the lake house. May we have many more Christmases here." His voice was steady, warm even. Sandra raised her glass and smiled. The boys lifted theirs too, the older 2 with sparkling water, Theo with juice. "To family," I said. I looked at my son across the table. He held my gaze for a brief moment, then looked away. And there it was again. That measuring, careful calculation behind the warmth. That night, after everyone was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and my phone. I sent a brief message to Raymond. Everything on schedule, proceeding tomorrow as discussed. His reply came 3 minutes later, confirming, "Emily lands at 9 a.m., drive safe." Christmas morning, I was up before 5. I made coffee and sat in the dark kitchen, watching the first pale light creep over the frozen lake. The ice had spread fully across the shallow edges, now white and still in the early morning. A crow perched on the dock post, motionless, and I watched it for a long while. Emily arrived at 9. She had flown in from Calgary the night before, stayed at a hotel, and now drove down the lane in her car. When she got out, I walked to meet her. She put her arms around me and held on for a long time, saying nothing. Michael came out of the house a few minutes later. He paused on the porch when he saw Emily's car, and I watched an expression cross his face, surprise followed by something more complicated. "Emily," he said, "you didn't say you were coming." "Last-minute decision," she replied, her voice perfectly steady. "I didn't want Dad to be the only one without family this Christmas." We went inside. We opened gifts with the boys, and it felt genuine. Theo's delight at the presents was completely authentic, pure, untouched by anything else. We had breakfast. Sandra was quieter than usual. Michael watched me with care, though he tried not to show it. After breakfast, I asked Michael to come out to the shed with me. I said I needed his help with something. He put on his coat and followed me across the yard. We stood in the cold shed, smelling old motor oil and firewood. I turned to him and spoke calmly, without anger. I had decided weeks ago that I would not approach this with anger. I told him what I knew. I spoke of the letter from Deborah Hayes, of my conversations with Raymond, and of what Raymond had discovered about the firm's finances and the nature of the legal inquiry. He froze. He made no attempt to deny it, signaling to me that he understood there was no point. He stared at the shed floor in silence for a long time. Then he said, "The firm is in trouble, Dad. I didn't know how to tell you." I replied, "That's not what you decided to do about it." He looked up at me, eyes wet. I couldn't even tell how much of it was genuine. I was looking at options. I was desperate. I wasn't actually going to... "Michael," I said evenly, "you retained a law firm to research contesting my will on the grounds of incapacity. You asked specifically about my health to gather information. That is not looking at options. That is a plan." He had no answer for that. I told him what I had done, the updated will, the power of attorney naming Emily, the physician's documentation. I told him that Raymond had copies of everything, and that the law firm he had retained had been formally notified that I was fully competent and legally represented. Any further inquiry would be treated as harassment. I told him that the lake house was not going to solve his firm's problems, and even if it had, he would never have accessed it through the path he was pursuing, because I had closed that path entirely. He sank onto an old wooden stool in the corner of the shed. He buried his face in his hands, crying, or nearly. I stood across from him and thought of Eleanor, of the morning he was born, and of 100 ordinary moments that together made up the weight of a life shared with a child. I thought of how much I would have given to have Eleanor there beside me in the shed, because she always knew the right thing to say. I said, "I love you. I will always love you. But what you were considering would have harmed me and destroyed what remains of this family. I will not pretend it didn't happen." I told him that if he wanted help with the firm, real, honest, direct help, a conversation about what he could do and what I was willing to consider was available. But it would happen on different terms, clean, straightforward, with no lawyers involved. Researching my cognitive decline. No letters to unknown law firms, no son quietly building a case, just a son asking his father for help, plainly and directly, the way it should have been from the start. He nodded, said nothing for a long while. We returned inside separately. Emily met my eyes when I came through the door, and I gave her a small nod. She looked down at her coffee and exhaled softly. The rest of Christmas Day felt strange and quiet, in the way days do when something true has been said aloud and cannot be unsaid. The boys played outside on the ice near the shore. Sandra was subdued, in a way that suggested she knew more than she let on, though I didn't press it. We had dinner and cleaned up together. The candles burned low. In the evening, Emily and I sat on the porch, wrapped in our coats with mugs of tea, watching the last light fade over the lake. The crow was gone. The ice had taken on a blue-gray hue in the dusk. She asked, "Are you okay, Dad?" I thought about it for a moment. "I think so," I said. "I will be." "What are you going to do about him? About the firm?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I replied. "I need to consider what I can do and what I should do. They aren't always the same." She placed her hand over mine, and we sat there for a while, silently, in that unspoken way you can with someone you've known your whole life. Michael and Sandra left on the 26th with the boys. The goodbye was awkward and real. Nothing was tidy about it. He hugged me at the car, I hugged him back, and we held on a moment longer than usual. I didn't fully understand what it meant, but it was not nothing. Emily stayed an extra night. We talked late into the night about her mother, the years ahead, the lake house, and what we might do with it someday. She said she was grateful I had handled things the way I had, not with lawyers, restraining orders, or public confrontation, but directly within the family. I admitted I wasn't certain it was the right choice, but it was the one I had made. The next morning, I drove her to the Winnipeg airport. We said our goodbyes at the departure's door. She turned and waved once, and I stayed until I could no longer see her. 3 months later, Michael visited me at the apartment. He came alone, without Sandra, and sat across the kitchen table. For the first time, he told me the full truth about the firm, how much debt there was, how it had accumulated, and the decisions he wasn't proud of. He spoke with an honesty I hadn't heard from him in years, maybe ever. I listened without interrupting. I told him I would not cover what had already been lost. Those funds were gone, and no part of my savings could change that. But I offered to pay for a consultation with a financial restructuring firm I trusted through professional contacts, and to co-sign a personal reference letter if he pursued new employment while winding down the practice. It wasn't a rescue. It was a handhold. The climb out was his to make. He accepted it and thanked me sincerely. The quality of that thank you was unlike anything I had heard from him in a long time, without the brightness of desire, without calculation. Just his voice, tired and grateful. I could hear in it the boy he had been and the man he was still figuring out how to be. I still live at the lake house. Winters are spent in Winnipeg, summers on the water, just as Eleanor and I always planned. The Manitoba maple remains. The dock is still solid. The loons returned in May, as they do every year. I often reflect on that Christmas, not with bitterness, but on the choices made, mine, Michael's, and those neither of us could fully undo. I think about how easy it is, when in financial trouble, to start seeing people as resources rather than as people. It happens gradually, in small rationalizations, until the gap between action and conscience feels smaller than it truly is. The opposite is true as well. When hurt, it is easy to respond with scorched earth completeness, using legal tools as weapons rather than protections. I had those tools. I had every right to use them that way. I chose not to. I cannot say with certainty that was right, but I can say it was a choice, and the choice mattered. It came from somewhere other than pride, anger, or the desire to win. If you are a parent or the adult child of an aging parent, hear this plainly. The assets your parent has accumulated are not an advance on your inheritance. They are the result of a life of work, sacrifice, and planning, long before you could grasp what it cost. They belong to them until they are gone. What happens after that is a gift, not an entitlement. If your family is struggling, ask for help. Speak the real words. Sit at the table and tell the truth. It is hard, humbling, and it is the only thing that keeps a family intact. The alternative, the quiet research, the measured calculations, the groundwork laid while someone sleeps in the next room, does not end where you think it will. Once you start down that path, even a little, something changes that cannot easily be undone. I know because I watched it in my son's eyes. I know because I watched the truth change things slowly, until all that remained between us was what was real. And that, in the end, is enough. It has to be.